Our next topic is going to be 20th century developments in Latin America, concentrating on Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. Brazil had originally been founded as a Portuguese colony back in the 15th century, and it wasn't until 1822 that it achieved independence in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. Brazil was then governed by a branch of the Portuguese royal family as a monarchy until 1889. At that point, Brazil transitioned into a republic that was dominated by a small number of the wealthy elite. One of the key figures of this period was Getulio Vargas, pictured here on the left, who ruled Brazil as dictator from 1930 until 1945, and then again from 1951 until 1954. During these periods, he promoted economic growth and modernization, but suppressed political opposition. Shortly after Vargas, Juscelino Kubitschek governed Brazil from 1956 until 1961. Perhaps most famously, he moved the capital to Brasilia, a newly planned city in the center of the country. He also encouraged foreign investment in his numerous development projects, but the Brazilian debt soared, leading to runaway inflation. His successors sought to gain popular support by breaking up large landed estates to distribute the land to peasants. In 1964, though, further land reform was prevented by a military coup. These military leaders continued huge development projects in the Amazon, but froze workers' wages and cut social programs, and as a result, the standard of living declined. The military leadership would not broker any opposition, and protesters faced censorship, jail, torture, and even execution. The economic recession eventually convinced the military to allow elections in 1985. The first democratically elected president of this period, José Sarney, failed to solve the economic crisis. In 1995, the Marxist scholar Fernando Cardoso was elected president. Despite these credentials, his economic reforms were largely capitalist attempts to narrow the income gap in Brazil. At the end of his term, Cardoso picked the pro-business José Serra to be his successor. Unfortunately for Serra, in 2002, an economic crisis hit that stalled growth and led to rising unemployment and growing poverty. As a result, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a leftist politician, pulled off the upset and was president from 2003 until 2011. Lula da Silva ruled more moderately than initially feared, and his chosen successor was elected in 2011. That was Dilma Rousseff. After a few years in office, though, scandal erupted concerning budgetary improprieties. Dilma Rousseff was impeached and removed from office in an investigation that also sent Lula da Silva to jail. In subsequent elections in 2019, the right-wing candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, won the presidency. After a complicated series of civil wars, Mexico eventually emerged from the Mexican Revolution with the Constitution of 1917. From 1920 until 1934, a series of generals were elected as presidents, not as dictators, but as members of the National Revolutionary Party. In 1934, Lázaro Cárdenas was elected president to serve a 6-year term. He improved the life of Mexico's peasants by land reform policies and supporting labor rights. He also nationalized the oil industry and kicked foreign oil companies out of Mexico. In 1946, the National Revolutionary Party changed its name to the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. This party won every presidential election and every congressional victory for decades. An opposition party was allowed, but it never won, and they frequently claimed that elections were fraudulent. The PRI also failed to solve Mexico's pressing economic problems of lack of land and jobs for the majority. At the same time, the party racked up huge foreign debts that led to giant interest payments. Growing opposition to the PRI was shown in the protests at the Aztec Market in Mexico City in 1968. In response, the government sent soldiers who opened fire on the crowd from protected positions, and hundreds of protesters were killed. Then, in 1981, the price of oil crashed. This led to a halving of government revenues since the state had become so dependent on oil money, and this sparked a sharp economic decline. As a result of this decline, the PRI suffered its first serious challenge in 1988. The PRI candidate for president, Carlos Salinas, did win, but enough opposition votes were cast to send opposition members to the Mexican Congress. Salinas was the president that signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, with the United States and Canada. In 1994, the state of Chiapas revolted against Mexico. This was an election year, and the PRI candidate for president, Luis Donaldo Colosio, was assassinated. Still, the PRI replacement candidate, Ernesto Zedillo, won the election. Even more opposition candidates were elected, though, and in 1997, enough opposition candidates were elected to the Mexican Congress to deny the PRI a majority. The major bombshell came in 2000, when a non-PRI candidate, Vicente Fox, won the presidency. He initiated an ambitious reform program to bring free market reforms and to try to fix the Mexican police and political cultures. He also tried to address the revolt in Chiapas. He was an advocate for Mexican migrant workers living in the U.S. He sought amnesty for Mexicans who were living in the U.S. in violation of their visas, but after 9/11, such hopes disappeared. In 2002, though, he created a cabinet-level agency to lobby the United States on behalf of the 22 million Mexican citizens living abroad. Argentina's post-war history could have been bright, with a strong economy based on both a large industrial class and agriculture, with a strong beef and grain sector. In 1946, the military officer Juan Perón was elected president, but he subsequently established a military dictatorship. His wife, Eva, was idolized by the Argentinian people and was a key factor in maintaining Perón's popularity. Perón introduced a number of social reforms that established Argentina as a welfare state. These programs were popular, but also limited Argentinian freedoms. Eva died in 1952, and Perón's popularity began to decline that led to his exile in 1955. He was replaced by a military group that governed in a repressive way for the next 18 years. In 1973, Perón returned from exile and resumed power, but then died the following year. In 1976, the military re-established its dictatorship in brutal fashion. The army hunted down its opponents, daily torturing and murdering civilians. Thousands of Argentinians ended up being disappeared by the military, by being kidnapped, murdered, and then buried by the government. In the end, it was the Falklands War that discredited the Argentinian military. In 1982, Argentina seized this British possession, but was then roundly defeated and embarrassed by the British military. Losing this war opened the door for the end of military rule, and in 1983, Raúl Alfonsín won the first free Argentinian election in decades. He spent 6 years rebuilding democratic institutions and trying to establish the economy. In 1989, Carlos Menem succeeded him as president. Menem established a stable currency for Argentina and privatized the industries that the military had seized. All of these changes proved too much, however, and Menem left office with a collapsing economy. Next was Fernando de la Rúa, who tried to shore up the economy, but the economic insecurity of debt and unemployment led the International Monetary Fund to refuse further aid to the state in December of 2001. Protests on this decision then drove Rúa to resign. Eduardo Duhalde fared little better. Not surprisingly, because he had actually lost the presidential election and only assumed the office as a result of the resignation of the previous incumbents. Under his rule, the unemployment rate shot up to 24%, and Argentina defaulted on its foreign debt. This debt stood at $132 billion and was the largest bankruptcy in history. As a result, the value of the Argentinian currency plummeted. Nestor Kirchner became president in 2003, when after finishing second place, the first-place candidate dropped out of the race. This first-place candidate was the previous president, Carlos Menem. Now, Kirchner was able to renegotiate deals to stabilize the Argentinian economy and also supported the prosecution of many of the military leaders who had committed crimes in the 1970s and 80s. In 2007, he decided not to run for re-election, but rather supported his wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who subsequently won the office.